Hello, everybody. Welcome to Expression Pass here on Boss Rush Network. I'm your host, the Enlightened Excited Eddie V. It's just me this episode because I kind of want to have this talk with you guys. Let's talk about nostalgia. I was scrolling on social media one day, and there was a post by someone who just wrote, "Nintendo sells nostalgia." And I kind of got to thinking about it. I'm just like, do they really? And if Nintendo does sell nostalgia, um, why does that not include PC games? Why that doesn't include Xbox? And why that doesn't include Sony PlayStation? Even Atari, you know, like we we think that Nintendo sells retro games and IPs that Nintendo own, which yeah, why not sell them? That is their business. That they, yes, they do sell hardware, but they also sell software. So if they're selling nostalgia, it's not that they're selling memories, they're selling retro style games. They're selling their regular IP. And I think we get that word confused, nostalgia and retro. So if I looked up the word, and this is coming from the Webster Dictionary. I want to give you guys the definition of nostalgia so that people could use this word a little bit better when they are um going to say that Nintendo is, relies on nostalgia or sells nostalgia. So, from Webster Dictionary, a nostalgia, which is a noun, means a wistful or excessively sentimental yearning for return to, or of some past period or irrecoverable condition. Also, something that evokes nostalgia. Two, the state of being homesick. Um, so and then they give some examples of it. My own feelings were that since I jettisoned employment, marriage, nostalgia, and swampy regret, I was not rightfully a man, a quiverer with possibility and purpose. Richard Ford, Independence Day, 1995. Um, and then Nevertheless, if one understands the nostalgia for war, which marked these years of his break with America, it still remains a nostalgia that is imperial and histrionic. Only once in his career did MacArthur lead as small a body of men as a company. One somehow feels that the ideal of MacArthur, even as a boy in command of anything less than the division, verges on the ludicrous. William Styron MacArthur, October 8th, 1964, in This Quiet Dust and Other Writings in 1982. And then they just get basic. A wave of nostalgia swept over me when I saw my childhood home, and he was filled with nostalgia for his college days. So if we look at the word nostalgia, like I said earlier, it's the memory of a certain past and everything. And when Nintendo is doing, selling games from their well-known IP, they're not selling a time that people will remember. They're just selling their regular IP and sequels or side games in those IP. There's a lot of people who didn't grow up with Nintendo, whether they were in Japan, here in America, or the UK. Um, so they don't have that memory of the past to games of now. Like some people didn't understand, didn't go through the things that Nintendo for as games wise didn't go through those Nintendo games when they released in the past. So Nintendo doesn't sell nostalgia. They just sell their IP that they're known for, who has a history of games that have came out. Some have been considered as game of the year. Some has changed the gaming industry. Some has, introduced people to the world of Nintendo or different genres, and then their new IP. Um, you know, and I think people just think that if they say nostalgia and using that word, they definitely get confused with retro, because retro is a stuff in the past of things. So I um gonna give you that definition of retro. Retro from the same Webster Dictionary is relating to revival or being the styles and especially the fashions of the past, fashionably nostalgic or old fashioned. And then if we look at some, it is a adjective, and so when we look at it, a basic one is retro fashions that seek to capture the lost glamour of Hollywood in the 1930s. And then in a sentence, the series is based on the popular Bethesda Game Studios game and features a apocalyptic wasteland of a retro American West. This is James Hilberg, Hollywood Reporter, June 5th of 2025, talking about Fallout. Um, over time, the visible air unites in retro versions of the shoe grew increasingly smaller, but this year's version has been tweaked to almost match the look and feel of the originals. Roddy Jones, Footwear News, May 24th, 2025. So, they kind of use some current things. So sentiments for retro is antique, old time, old fango, vintage, old fashioned, old timey, quaint, old school, old world, retrograde. So I think people kind of get those two words confused, nostalgia and retro. And it's I don't want to say that it's been bothering me, but I was on a single player podcast, which you guys should go definitely check out, and we got to talking about retro and nostalgia, and I kind of I kind of just I didn't lose it, but I kind of want to understand why people think that when it comes to Nintendo, that they could just say, shout out to Sebastian Mulder for the single player podcast that he hosts. I kind of get not frustrated, but I kind of just want to understand why do people think that only Nintendo sells nostalgia and not Sony and Microsoft? Is it because of the gangs? Because with Sony, they also have a history of gangs. That's over 20 years. Microsoft have a history of gangs that's over 20 years. So Xbox is selling their 25th anniversary next year. And that's from 2000. So it's kind of weird that no one talks about um Microsoft and Sony PlayStation saying that they sell nostalgia or rely on nostalgia, because I'm like, if we're gonna use that term, um definitely Xbox relies on nostalgia. Halo. Look how many Halo games that are out and why people hold Halo to such a high degree. If you grew up in the 2000s and you had an Xbox, you were playing Halo 1. Halo 1 was the game. I won't say it's the equivalent to Half-Life 2 or anything, but Halo 1 was the Mario Brothers of that heyday that you knew. Sony, yeah, they have Final Fantasy 7, but Final Fantasy 7 wasn't Sony's first party. That was Square Enix. I think when Sony really got, of course, they had Crash and Ratchet and Clank and all of these other games, the Spiral the Dragon and stuff, but like Sony didn't have really its most number one game until God of War came out. People could not stop talking about God of War and how that changed the action landscape. While um Capcom had Devil May Cry and everything. So it's kind of, I'm like, if we're going to look at it that way, God of War is still like one of Sony's biggest heavy hitters and stuff. Yeah, there's Death Stranding, and there's other games like The Last of Us and The Horizon Zero Dawn, but those games, you know, came out way later on powerful hardware. So if we talk about nostalgia from PlayStation, like God of War is gonna be that game, but that's from PlayStation 2, not PlayStation 1. What has Nintendo nostalgia have? So if you didn't grow up playing that, if you go back to, like, you got to think of like 79, 80. And a little few more years past that, you got to think of like their playing cards and like the games that they made from that. You got to think about the arcade riches of Donkey Kong and Punch Out and stuff. And that's stuff that Nintendo doesn't sell. We don't get the Fudica cards that Nintendo was known for when it comes to gaming. Like that would be nostalgia if that's what they're gonna sell. Was gonna sell. I think people get confused with Nintendo relies on that retro style of gaming, but if you look at a lot of Nintendo games, um, they haven't went back to a retro style till maybe like definitely with their IP. Like Super Mario didn't go back to its retro style until some new Super Mario Brothers for the 3DS and for Wii. They had went 3D as technology advanced. You know, um if you look at the Legend of Zelda, when it went to the N64, it was Ocarina of Time, and it kept it 3D for a couple of systems. It didn't get back to the 2D. Of course, we have GameCube with Minish Cap, but like that was the last one. After Minish Cap came out, like for kind of like I'm gonna say a man game, not a side game. It didn't go back to like top down into Link Between Worlds. It like oh well, I won't say yeah, probably between Link Between Worlds, and there is the DS Wind Waker style game, that one too. But like, to have that traditional, because you that traditional nostalgia, like people who hold up Link to the Past and everything, the continuation and Link Between Worlds using like that same style map, like that would have been nostalgia, because Link to the Past was from the Super Nintendo days back in the early 90s compared to the days of now, or at the time that game was released. Fire Emblem didn't even have you can't even rely on Fire Emblem for nostalgia, because it's been on the NES or Famicom in Japan for such a long time. We didn't get into like the Game Boy Advance, and then people really didn't get into the series through Fire Emblem Awakening. So how is Nintendo selling nostalgia when there's different points of games in these series and these IPs that Nintendo has had for people to get in, to create those experiences, to look back at, where um these games are memorable and everything. Yamaguchi, who was the president of Nintendo at that time, like he had strict rules about people putting their games, the publishers and developers putting their games on Nintendo. Like if we was gonna sell nostalgia for a lot of these companies, there would have been no indies. Barely we would have any kind of American games on the system. Um, if we was gonna get a game for Capcom and stuff, well, those games we only could get one or two, because you couldn't release past 5 games within a year for the platform. And so those companies would have had to like make shell companies. Why you think Konami made Ultra so they could get more games out? That's why the Ninja Turtles, when it came out, it was on Ultra. It wasn't on Konami, because Konami could do like Contra, Double Dribble, in another game. But that's all. But once they hit their limit, they couldn't release no other games, so they had to create side companies in order to release more games for the company, because that rule was in place, and it didn't take almost until the Super Nintendo for that rule to change and get taken down. Like if we're gonna offer nostalgia, you have to actually grow up through the years of the NES. Just here in America that I'm speaking for right now, in order to understand the nostalgia that Nintendo is selling. Just say, if you're gonna be like, Nintendo relies on their strong IP from retro style games till now. Just say that. If you would say that and be like, that's what they produce, that's what they sell, then yes, but also give Nintendo those props for their new IP. Also, give them more props. Is that those games are still selling? Those IPs are still recognizable. Any company would love to have Nintendo's strong IP, be able to put those games out and have the strong sales throughout the decades that Nintendo has been out with video game consoles and handhelds. We now enter this era with the Switch 2, and we're kind of trying to realize what it is that what we're going to see in the future for the console. It We don't know at this time, but I just gotta say I'm excited to see what Nintendo's going to do. I don't think Nintendo just relies on nostalgia, they don't really they don't rely on that. I think there are products that they bring out that might give a nostalgia feel to it, but you have to grow up during those eras of early Nintendo, not just the GameCube and onward, or Wii or Wii U and onward and everything. It just see that these adults who are using that phrase that Nintendo sells nostalgia. You got to be like, well, did you grow up with Nintendo back in the 80s, and part of the 90s? Like, did you grow up? Because if they didn't grow up, then they just really should just say, hey, Nintendo relies on their strong IP, and they use uh, those IP to sell their systems and consoles. All of them do that. PC still do it. Like, why doesn't Steam get it? When Valve opened up this digital store where third party and they were putting their own games and still selling old games, why haven't nobody said anything about that? Why haven't no one talked about nostalgia? Is it because that was catered to the PC community and PC is different than console? Why no one really says about my Xbox and PlayStation? Is it because they don't have a strong lineup of IPs that people remember or recognize? That or has considered them as retro as they came out, or when they started. Why is it just Nintendo? And I think some people love to have the attention to have that discussion and everything when it comes to nostalgia and the retro stuff. That Nintendo is a easy name to recognize and trigger people for them to have this conversation and get eyes and views on their content or on their tweet, and try to do that for engagement and everything. So I kind of just wanted to speak a little bit about that because I don't think Nintendo steals nostalgia. I think Nintendo has a strong IP, and they're going to continue to have a strong IP as they put out games, as they create new games, as new teams and developers, come to Nintendo and work with those who have created games, who have directed games. Um, we could recognize the the old school teachers like Miyamoto and them and their works, and how they are helping new directors and producers create games that still have that Nintendo feel to it, but also make sure that the quality is up to a standard that you recognize it as a Nintendo game. Just wanted to speak about that. If you guys have any thoughts or have any opinions, I want to hear about them. Come let me know in our Discord. What did you guys think? It's like when you hear nostalgia, can you give me examples of what it makes you think of, what it makes you remember? It don't even have to be video game related. It could be the smell of food. It could be a roller coaster. It could be an outfit. What brings you nostalgia? And then if there are games that you have played that have that retro feel, or you recognize an aesthetic being like a retro style game, also let me know what games have you been playing, or what games that you know of, that showcase that. Because I really think that when we think of Nintendo, we think of their strong IP. We think of Mario, we think of Zelda, we think of um, Smash Brothers. Now we think of Fire Emblem and some of their other games, Splatoon, Pikmin, Animal Crossing. We think of those games. So let us know on our Discord at Boss Rush. But then everybody have a great week, have a great weekend, and I will talk to you guys next time here on Expansion Pass. Bye, everybody.
If you want to see how you can become a Patreon producer, head on over to patreon.com/BossRushNetwork. The Patreon producers for this month are Adriel Munger, Austin Campbell, Celeste Roberts, Sana Dierig, Francisco Santillan, Matthew Keel,
Retrostoy,
and Christian S. Thanks for your continued support of the Boss Rush Network.